Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the vast expanse of space, where the boundaries between right and wrong blur under the weight of interstellar diplomacy, John Carter, a seasoned lawyer from Earth, stood before the imposing structure of the Galactic Tribunal on Kaplan. It was a neutral planet, untouched by the wars and politics that plagued other corners of the universe. Here, justice was not only a practice but a spectacle, where the fates of entire civilizations were decided by a panel of the most powerful beings in existence. John had handled many cases in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this, defending an alien race accused of unspeakable war crimes. The Turok, a militaristic species known for their ruthless efficiency, were facing extermination for their actions during the recent conflict with the Crethians, another formidable race. The charges against the Turok were grave: genocide, the obliteration of entire colonies, and the use of forbidden weaponry that left planets uninhabitable. As he stepped into the courtroom, John couldn't help but feel the weight of the task ahead. The chamber was vast, with high ceilings that seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with holographic displays projecting the history of the tribunal. Representatives from countless species filled the seats, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. In the center, a circular platform hovered, where John would soon present his defense. The trial was not just about the Turok's guilt or innocence, it was about the very definition of justice in a universe as diverse as this one. The Crethians were pushing for the harshest penalty, arguing that the Turok's actions threatened the stability of the entire galaxy. But John knew there was more to this case than what appeared on the surface. His first task was to establish a connection with the Turok themselves. The species was not known for their diplomacy. They were warriors, bred for battle, with little regard for the nuances of law. John met with Sarah, the Turok's representative, in a secure chamber deep within the tribunal's complex. Sarah was as formidable as he had expected, tall, with a presence that radiated authority. Her skin was a deep blue, almost metallic, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, studied John with suspicion. "You are not like the others," Sarah said, her voice resonating with a calm intensity. John nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I'm not here to judge you, Sarah. I'm here to understand. To find the truth." Sarah remained silent for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Our truth is one of survival. We did what was necessary. But the tribunal sees it differently," John replied, leaning forward. "They see mass destruction, millions of innocent lives lost. Necessary sacrifices," Sarah countered, her tone resolute. "If we hadn't acted, the Crethians would have wiped us out. They provoked us, pushed us into a corner. We had no choice." John listened carefully, noting the conviction in her words. He had read the reports, seen the images of the devastation left in the wake of the Turok's campaign. It was easy to paint them as the villains, but he knew that in war, the lines were never that clear. Over the next few days, John immersed himself in the case, poring over every piece of evidence, every witness statement. He met with the tribunal's members, each one representing a different species, each with their own agenda. Some were sympathetic to the Turok's plight, understanding the harsh realities of interstellar conflict. Others, particularly those aligned with the Crethians, were adamant that the Turok needed to be made an example of. In his quarters, John wrestled with the moral complexities of the case. How do you defend actions that seem indefensible? How do you argue for mercy when the crimes are so heinous? The more he delved into the details, the more he realized that this trial was about more than just the Turok. It was a test of the entire system, of whether the tribunal could truly deliver justice in a galaxy where every species had its own version of right and wrong. The trial began with the Crethians presenting their case. Their representative, a shrewd diplomat named Varric, laid out the charges with meticulous detail, showing holovids of destroyed cities, barren landscapes, and the charred remains of once thriving colonies. The evidence was overwhelming, and as Varric spoke, the tension in the room grew palpable. The Crethians demanded nothing less than the total eradication of the Turok. John's turn came next. He stood on the platform, feeling the eyes of the entire galaxy upon him. He knew this was his moment, not just to save the Turok, but to challenge the very foundation of the tribunal's authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the tribunal," John began, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "we are here not just to judge the actions of the Turok, but to reflect on what it means to seek justice in a universe as vast and diverse as ours. The Turok did not seek war, they were pushed into it. They were fighting for their survival, against a foe that sought to annihilate them. The Crethians would have you believe that the Turok are monsters, but monsters do not care for the survival of their kind. They do not fight for the future of their children." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The evidence presented by the Crethians is undeniable, there was great loss, and for that, there must be accountability. But we must also consider the context. In a war where the stakes were survival or extinction, can we truly judge the Turok by the same standards we would apply in peacetime?" The room was silent, the weight of his argument hanging in the air. John continued, weaving in the evidence he had gathered, showing that the Turok had attempted diplomacy, that their actions, while brutal, were not without cause. He highlighted the political machinations of the Crethians, suggesting that this trial was less about justice and more about eliminating a rival power. As the trial progressed, John found himself drawn deeper into the web of interstellar politics. He uncovered documents suggesting that the Crethians had indeed manipulated events to provoke the Turok, forcing them into a corner where war was the only option. This revelation sent shockwaves through the tribunal, shaking the very foundation of the case against the Turok. In the final days of the trial, John stood before the tribunal one last time. "We have seen the horrors of war, and we have seen the lengths to which the Crethians went to push the Turok into a conflict they did not want. The question before us now is not just whether the Turok are guilty, but whether we can allow ourselves to be complicit in a greater injustice. If we condemn the Turok without acknowledging the full scope of events, we are no better than those who manipulate the truth for their own ends." The tribunal deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The fate of an entire race hung in the balance, and the weight of their decision was apparent on the faces of the representatives. Finally, the verdict was delivered: the Turok would not be eradicated. They would be held accountable for their actions, but the punishment would be proportional, focusing on reparations and rebuilding rather than destruction. The Crethians, too, would face sanctions for their role in the conflict, a decision that sent a clear message to all civilizations in the galaxy. As John left the tribunal, he felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The trial had been a grueling test of his skills, his morals, and his very understanding of justice. He returned to Earth, carrying with him the lessons he had learned. In a universe as complex as theirs, justice was not a fixed point but a spectrum, constantly shifting with the tides of politics, culture, and survival. John knew that he would never see the universe the same way again. The trial had changed him, opened his eyes to the fragile balance that held the galaxy together. As he looked up at the stars, he wondered how many more battles like this would be fought, and whether justice could ever truly be served in a universe where every species had its own truth. John Carter stepped out of the Galactic Tribunal, the weight of the trial still heavy on his shoulders. The corridors of the tribunal complex were quiet, a stark contrast to the intensity of the courtroom. The walls were lined with holographic displays of previous cases, each one a reminder of the gravity and history of the decisions made here. As he walked, the enormity of what had just transpired began to settle in. The Turok had been spared, but at what cost? The Crethians had been sanctioned, but the political fallout from this verdict was just beginning. John found himself at the edge of the tribunal's complex, overlooking the vast cityscape of Kaplan. The city, with its towering spires and endless streams of hovercraft, was a hub of interstellar diplomacy and trade, a place where deals were made and alliances forged. But today, it felt empty to John. The victory in the courtroom was bittersweet. He had saved the Turok, but he knew that the ripples of this trial would spread far beyond Kaplan. He activated his communicator, reaching out to Sarah. The Turok representative had been stoic throughout the trial, a pillar of strength for her people. But John knew that beneath that exterior, there was a deep well of emotion, of relief and gratitude. The line connected, and Sarah's voice came through, steady and controlled. "John," she said, "the tribunal's decision, it is more than we could have hoped for." "It's a beginning," John replied, gazing out over the city. "But there's still a long road ahead. The sanctions against the Crethians will not go unnoticed. They will push back, and you need to be prepared for that." "We are always prepared," Sarah said, her tone resolute. "But we will not forget what you have done for us. The Turok do not forget their allies." John appreciated the sentiment, but he knew that alliances in this universe were as fragile as they were necessary. "Take care of your people, Sarah. The galaxy is watching, and they'll be waiting for any excuse to turn on you again." "We will," she assured him. "And you, John, what will you do now?" John paused, considering the question. The trial had consumed him for so long that he hadn't thought beyond it. The life of a lawyer, especially one dealing in interstellar law, was never straightforward. There was always another case, another crisis. But this one had changed him, had shown him the depths to which even the most advanced civilizations could sink. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I think I need some time to think. To figure out what all of this means." "Take your time," Sarah said. "But know that if you ever need anything, the Turok will be there for you." The line disconnected, and John was left alone with his thoughts. He knew he couldn't stay on Kaplan. The city was a symbol of everything he had just fought against: political maneuvering, backroom deals, and the endless cycle of power plays. He needed to get away, to clear his head and figure out what kind of future he wanted to be a part of. John booked passage on the first transport out of Kaplan, a small, unassuming freighter bound for the outer colonies. The ship was a far cry from the sleek vessels of the core worlds, but that suited John just fine. He needed the anonymity, the solitude. The crew didn't ask questions, and John was grateful for that. He spent most of the journey in his cabin, staring out at the stars as they streaked by, contemplating the events of the past weeks. The outer colonies were a different world entirely. Far from the polished corridors of the tribunal, these were places where life was hard, where people worked to survive and didn't have the luxury of politics. John found himself in a small colony on the edge of known space, a place where the hustle of daily life drowned out the noise in his head. He spent his days wandering the colony, talking to the people, learning their stories. These were settlers, miners, farmers, people who had chosen this life because it offered them a freedom they couldn't find anywhere else. They lived on the fringes, where the laws of the core worlds didn't always reach, and where justice was often a matter of who had the strongest resolve. John found a strange comfort in the simplicity of the colony. Here, there were no grand trials, no debates over the fate of civilizations. Justice was dealt with directly, disputes settled by the people involved. It reminded John of why he had become a lawyer in the first place: to help people, to make a difference in their lives. But somewhere along the way, that purpose had been lost in the grandeur and complexity of interstellar law. One evening, as John sat in a small tavern, nursing a drink, a man approached him. He was older, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. He sat down across from John without asking, his gaze steady. "You're Carter, aren't you?" the man asked. John nodded, not surprised that his name had made it even out here. "I am." The man leaned back in his chair, studying John. "You've done a lot of good in your time. A lot of people talk about that trial back on Kaplan." "I'm not sure good is the right word," John replied, swirling his drink. "I just did what I thought was right." The man nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected. "That's what matters out here. People doing what they think is right. But the thing is, right and wrong, they're not always clear." "No, they're not," John agreed, thinking back to the trial, to the decisions that had been made in that sterile courtroom. "But sometimes, you just have to make a choice and live with it." The man smiled, a hint of something like respect in his expression. "I've got a problem," he said after a moment. And I could use someone who knows how to navigate complicated situations. John looked at him, waiting. There's a dispute, the man continued, between two groups out here. It's about land, resources. Nothing new. But it's escalating, and we're worried it's going to turn into something worse. John didn't need to ask why the man had come to him. It was clear that even out here, far from the core worlds, people had heard of his work, of the way he had handled the complexities of the tribunal. He was known as someone who could untangle the most intricate of knots, who could find a path where others saw only chaos. I'll take a look, John said finally, setting his drink down. But I'm not promising anything. Sometimes, there's no clear answer. The man nodded, grateful for even that small commitment. That's all we're asking for. The next morning, John found himself on the outskirts of the colony, where the dispute was brewing. It was a familiar scene, two groups, both with valid claims, both with too much to lose. The tension was palpable, and it was clear that if something wasn't done soon, it would erupt into violence. John spent the day talking to both sides, listening to their grievances, their fears. He saw echoes of the trial in their arguments, the same stubbornness, the same unwillingness to back down. But there was also something else, something that hadn't been present in the tribunal, a desire for peace. These were people who didn't want to fight, who didn't want to see their homes torn apart by a conflict that could be avoided. As the sun began to set, John called both groups together. They met in a clearing, the sky above turning a deep orange as the day came to an end. John stood between them, feeling the weight of their expectations. There's no easy solution here, John began, his voice carrying across the clearing. But there is a solution. It's going to require compromise, and it's going to require trust. But if you're willing to listen to each other, to work together, you can avoid the bloodshed that's coming. He laid out a plan, one that would require both sides to give up something but would also ensure that they both gained something in return. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and it was better than the alternative. There was resistance, of course, there always was. But John had learned that sometimes, it wasn't about convincing people that your way was right. It was about showing them that the alternative was worse. By the time the stars had fully emerged in the sky, the agreement was made. It was a tentative peace, fragile and easily broken, but it was a start. The groups dispersed, and John was left alone in the clearing, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He knew that this was what he had been looking for, something real, something that mattered. The galaxy was full of grand battles, of trials that decided the fate of entire civilizations. But it was also full of moments like this, where the decisions of a few could change the lives of many. John returned to the colony, feeling a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The trial had been a victory, but this was something more. It was a reminder that justice wasn't just about the big moments, the grand gestures. It was about the everyday choices, the small acts of kindness and fairness that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart. He knew that he couldn't stay in the colony forever. There were other places that needed him, other disputes that needed resolving. But for now, he was content to stay, to help where he could, to be a part of something that was bigger than himself. As he lay in his bed that night, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, John realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not the glory, not the recognition, but the simple act of doing what was right. And in that moment, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it.